Have you ever noticed how people get angrier not when you do something wrong, but when you do something right? And I don't mean right by their rules. I mean right by your truth. You stood up. You chose clarity over confusion, integrity over approval, and peace over performance. And suddenly, they're mad as hell. But why? Why does choosing yourself, choosing authenticity, cause such a violent reaction? Let's break a toxic myth right now, that standing firm in your values means you're selfish. That not bowing makes you arrogant. That going your own way is betrayal. No. That's a lie fed to us from the moment we learn to seek validation outside ourselves. It's time to question it. You see, most of us are conditioned to believe that keeping the peace means keeping ourselves small. We're taught that compromise is noble, even when it costs us our dignity. But what if I told you the opposite is true? That your refusal to kneel is not an act of defiance, but an act of liberation? That the rage you now face is not punishment, but proof you're no longer trapped? The people who are furious aren't angry because you wronged them, they're angry because you reminded them they had a choice, and they didn't take it. That kind of confrontation is rare. It's disruptive. It's sacred. It's the heartbeat of Stoicism in motion. This isn't just a motivational speech. This is a radical shift in how you see yourself, and how you interpret resistance. It's a path of power through self-respect. And yes, it's a lonely path. But it's also the only path that leads to peace. In this video, we're going to walk through 6 profound realities, 6 reasons why they're mad as hell because you won't bow. Each one will hit deeper than the last. Each one will help you understand your strength, not as rebellion, but as sovereignty. If you've ever felt isolated after choosing growth, if you've ever felt punished for being honest, or if you're finally tired of explaining yourself to people who only listened when you were shrinking, this is for you. So before you let the shame in, before you let the guilt take hold, ask yourself, what if their rage isn't proof you're failing, but proof you're finally free? Stay with me. Because the final insight? It's the one that'll change how you see all of it, and you'll never bow again. 1. Your refusal is a mirror. They look at you, and what do they see? Not just a person. Not just a choice. They see a reflection, one they've been running from their entire lives. You stand in stillness, and that stillness screams. It echoes into the spaces where they buried their shame. And here's the thing, they can't unsee it. Because when someone refuses to bow, they create a disturbance. A quiet quake that unsettles everything people around them pretend is solid. You become the evidence they wish didn't exist. Evidence that someone can walk away. Evidence that someone can stop performing. Evidence that someone can say no, and not collapse. So they rage. But what exactly are they raging against? It's not your defiance. It's what your defiance reveals about them. When you choose truth over compliance, you become a threat. Not because you harmed them. Not because you disrespected them. But because you stopped harmonizing with the script they've clung to for security. You didn't just leave the stage. They noticed you stopped acting. And that stings. Because it reminds them they were always pretending. And no one likes being reminded that their mask is a choice, not a necessity. It takes stoicism to stand in the middle of that kind of projection and remain unmoved. It takes discipline to not retaliate when you know their attacks are misfired confessions. But that's what your strength is doing, it's forcing them to confront their own betrayals. Not the betrayal of others, but of self. Because they too had a voice they silenced. They too had standards they lowered. They too bowed when they didn't want to. And now, your refusal acts like a mirror. Not just any mirror, a brutal, unfiltered, unforgiving one. The kind that shows every scar, every compromise, every small death they chose just to be accepted. Can you feel that? That discomfort they're spewing at you isn't yours to fix. It isn't your problem to soothe. That's their reckoning. Because deep down, they know. They know the version of you that once bowed gave them comfort. Not because you were kind, but because you didn't confront them. You didn't expose their mediocrity by choosing excellence. You didn't disrupt their apathy by moving toward purpose. But now, every time you speak with clarity, every time you move with intention, every time you say, no, without explanation, you reflect a version of themselves they abandoned. And they hate that. Not because it hurts them physically, but because it hurts the illusion they spent years crafting. Have you ever noticed that the people who were once warm turn cold when you evolve? That's not coincidence. That's psychology. Because nothing unnerves the complacent more than the growth of someone they thought they understood. You used to be predictable. You used to be safe. But now, your energy is sovereign. And sovereignty makes the controlled panic. They want you to explain. They want you to justify. They want you to soften your strength so they don't have to feel weak in comparison. But Stoic relationships don't work that way. In a relationship governed by Stoicism, you don't perform for connection. You connect through truth. You don't bargain with your values for proximity. You stand in them and see who stays. And let's be clear, many won't. They'll call your growth arrogance. They'll name your silence as rejection. But their labels are lazy. They're desperate attempts to put you back in a box they can recognize. But you don't fit anymore. That's not your arrogance. That's your evolution. And evolution, by nature, doesn't ask for permission. So yes, they're mad. Furious even. But not because you wronged them. Because you reminded them of who they could have been. And they can't stand to see it in your eyes. The fire they extinguished in themselves. Your composure under pressure, your peace in chaos, your refusal to chase, it all disturbs them. And you must understand why. Because until you do, you'll keep questioning your transformation. You'll keep second-guessing your strength. But there's nothing to second-guess here. You're not breaking bonds, you're breaking patterns. You're not abandoning them, you're reclaiming yourself. And that shift? It's seismic. It ripples through every dysfunctional system you once served. The game you stopped playing didn't just frustrate them. It collapsed the illusion that the game was necessary. Think about that. How many people do you know who pride themselves on control? On keeping others close by keeping them dependent? When you stepped away from that economy, when you stopped trading pieces of your soul for scraps of attention, you didn't just exit the room. You took the air with you. That silence, that unavailability, that inner calm, they're not signs of disconnection. They're signs of mastery. And mastery feels like menace to those who only know connection through chaos. So yes, your stillness is loud. Your boundaries are bold. Your detachment is powerful. But that doesn't make you cruel. It makes you clear. And clarity is rare in a world drunk on confusion. So they lash out. They spread rumors. They mischaracterize your intentions. And you must let them. Let them twist. Let them interpret. Let them do what they must to make sense of your refusal. Because their confusion is not your concern. Their discomfort is not your emergency. That's where Stoicism lives, in the space between their chaos and your calm. In the discipline it takes to not react. In the strength it takes to witness their meltdown and not make it your mission to soothe it. You are not their regulator. You are not their savior. You are not their audience. You are the mirror. And that mirror, though painful, is medicine. Not everyone will take it. Most will spit it out. But that's not your failure. That's their fear. Fear that they missed the chance to rise with you. Fear that they chose approval over authenticity. Fear that their silence wasn't safety, but self-abandonment. And your refusal to bow? That's what made it all visible. You didn't say much. You didn't fight. You just stood, still, unshaken, grounded. And in that simple posture, you shouted a truth their entire belief system was built to avoid. That freedom was always an option. That strength was always a choice. That peace wasn't given, it was built. And you chose to build it. Brick by brick. Boundary by boundary. Moment by moment. Not out of spite. Not to punish. But because you were tired of bleeding for a connection that only survived as long as you remained small. You were tired of performing for love. Tired of shrinking for peace. Tired of explaining your soul in a language that only understood submission. So you stopped. and now they rage. Not because you harmed them, but because you healed. And healing, when done fully, becomes a weapon, not one you wield, but one they feel. Because it cuts through everything they told themselves about why staying small was noble. It cuts through their story of being the good one, the strong one, the sacrificial one. And it leaves them with one terrifying question: what if I betrayed myself for nothing? And that question? That's the reason they're mad as hell. You reminded them they had a choice. You embodied the freedom they said wasn't real. You became the person they claimed was impossible. And now, every time they see you, they're forced to reckon with that fact. That truth. That mirror. And most people? They'd rather shatter the mirror than face what it reveals. So let them throw stones. Let them scream. Let them call you every name but free. You know the truth. You didn't abandon them. You stopped abandoning yourself. And in doing so, you became a reflection they can't stand to see, but one they desperately need to. That's not rebellion. That's restoration. That's stoicism embodied. That's why they're mad. And that's why you must keep standing. Quietly. Powerfully. Unshaken. 2. They build power on your compliance. You didn't just walk away from a person, you dismantled a system. One that wasn't built with you in mind, but on top of you. Every time you said yes when you meant no, every time you silenced yourself to keep the peace, every time you made yourself small so others could feel tall, you were feeding it. And they got comfortable with that. Too comfortable. They built their power on your compliance, their identity on your obedience. So the day you stopped playing along, the whole structure began to tremble. Have you noticed how quickly admiration turns to accusation when you stop being who they want you to be? It's not coincidence. It's cause and effect. Because you didn't just change roles, you took your energy with you. And for people who relied on your guilt, your submission, your need for their validation, your exit wasn't just inconvenient, it was devastating. Not because they lost your love, but because they lost their leverage. That's what people don't talk about when they speak of healing. They romanticize it. Make it sound like a sunrise. But the truth? Healing is a storm. Especially for those who only felt powerful when you were broken. You were their anchor, but only because you were shackled. You were their comfort, but only because you didn't challenge them. And now that you do, now that you've redefined what's acceptable, what's tolerable, what's true, they say you've become difficult. But let's be honest. You're not difficult. You're just no longer digestible. You no longer shrink yourself into a palatable version of who they need you to be. And that refusal? That new definition of self-respect? It exposed the dynamic for what it really was, a transaction, not a relationship. An arrangement where your silence was the currency. Your agreement was the glue. Your guilt was the leash. And once you cut it, everything collapsed. They had power, yes, but only because you agreed to the game. You played your part. You walked the script. And the moment you stepped off stage, they didn't lose control of you, they lost control of their identity. Because if you're not who they told themselves you were, then who are they? What does it mean for them if the weak one becomes strong, if the quiet one starts speaking, if the needy one suddenly doesn't need their approval to breathe? That's the crisis. That's why the backlash feels so personal. Because it is. You were never just a person in their life. You were a mirror that made their control feel justified. Their dominance feel noble. Their manipulation feel like leadership. But when you stood up, when you drew that line, it all unraveled. Not just for them, but for the entire illusion they built around your submission. And that unraveling? It's violent. Not physically, but psychologically. Because the systems that rely on your silence don't crumble quietly. They scream. They accuse. They lash out. That's not because you're wrong. That's because the foundation was always a lie. A lie that said your worth was tied to their opinion. That peace meant pleasing. That love required sacrifice, but only yours. That if you just kept giving, eventually they'd see your value. But let me ask you something, when did that actually work? When did your endless giving make them give more? When did your compliance earn their respect? When did your boundaries being crossed result in connection instead of resentment? The answer is, it didn't. Because you weren't dealing with a relationship. You were dealing with a power imbalance disguised as intimacy. And now? Now you see it. Now you feel the weight of your own worth. You no longer trade your authenticity for belonging. You no longer believe that being needed is the same as being loved. That's what Stoic relationships teach us. Love is not dependency. Love is freedom. Real connection isn't about who controls whom. It's about who can remain themselves in the presence of another. And if someone needs you small to feel big, that's not connection. That's a cage. So you broke the lock. You walked out. And the noise that followed? That's not justice, it's withdrawal. It's the tantrum of a system that lost its grip. Don't mistake their volume for virtue. Loud doesn't mean right. It just means disrupted. And you were the disruption. Not because you screamed, but because you stopped apologizing. You stopped compensating. You stopped editing yourself to be tolerable. And now your wholeness is an offense. Your boundaries are perceived as betrayal. Your clarity is called confrontation. But the only thing you did was stop being controllable. And that, more than anything, is what shook them. Because your submission wasn't just a convenience, it was their fuel. You gave them emotional oxygen. And now that you've taken it back, they're gasping. Not because they need you, but because they need the role you played. They don't miss the real you. They miss the version of you that danced to their rhythm, that bent under their moods, that kept quiet when they crossed lines. But that version is gone. Dead. And in its place is someone dangerous. Not dangerous in violence, but in truth. Because a person who no longer needs to be liked is unstoppable. A person who lives by values instead of validation is a system breaker. And when you stopped being dependent, you didn't just become free, you made them confront their own dependency. That's what makes you dangerous. That's what makes them mad. You're not playing the game. You're not running the program. And now, their power has nowhere to land. You see, manipulation requires cooperation. Control needs consent. And you revoked yours. Quietly. Calmly. Completely. That's why they're spiraling. Not because you're cold, but because you're clear. You no longer orbit around their needs. You no longer adjust your light to ease their insecurity. And every time you walk into a room, every time you hold your ground, every time you smile without needing them, it shatters the lie they lived on. The lie that said your power belonged to them. It never did. It was borrowed, lent, leased. And now that it's returned to its rightful owner, they don't know who they are without it. That's not your fault. That's their work. You're not responsible for rebuilding the illusion they depended on. You're responsible for staying free. For honoring the version of you who cried alone, doubted silently yet still rose. This isn't revenge. This isn't rebellion. This is restoration. And restoration always upsets those who benefited from your ruin. So let them be mad. Let them whisper. Let them question. You're not the same, and that's the point. Because the moment you stop feeding a system, it either transforms or dies. And you weren't born to maintain dysfunction. You were born to break patterns. To disrupt legacies of silence. To rise even when they swore you'd never stand. That's what's happening now. You're not just reclaiming peace, you're redefining power. Not power over others, but power over yourself. The kind that doesn't flinch in storms. The kind that doesn't collapse when accused. The kind that can say, "This is who I am," without apology. That's stoicism in action. That's what makes you unshakable. And if this message resonates with you, if you've ever felt that shift within yourself, the moment you stopped performing and started becoming, then let me know. Like this video and comment, number 1, if this truth is hitting home. Subscribe if you're ready to keep walking the path of clarity, peace and real strength. This isn't just content, it's confirmation. You're not alone. You're not lost. You're rising. And the backlash? That's just the sound of systems breaking. Keep going. 3. Presence, not words, disturbs them most. They don't hate you because of what you said, they hate you because of what you didn't say. They're not angry at your argument, they're angry at your silence. The stillness. The pause between chaos. You walked away without slamming the door, and yet the sound of your absence is deafening to them. It's not your voice that's too loud now, it's your presence. And that presence, grounded and detached, calm and immovable, is a threat to everything that once held power over you. The truth is, they were never really upset by your anger, they were empowered by it. It was a sign you still cared. That they still had a grip. But now you don't flinch. You don't react. You don't argue. You don't entertain the same emotional games. That's what terrifies them. Because when someone can't provoke you, they lose their sense of relevance. And when someone built their identity on managing how others feel, especially you, your emotional neutrality feels like erasure. Not because you're erasing them, but because you're no longer participating in the dance. The performance is over. The script has been tossed. And suddenly, they're left with no lines to speak. No cues to follow. No reactions to control. You see, they were never in love with you. They were in love with the version of you who responded on command. Who danced between emotional traps like a performer trained by pain. But your healing cut the strings. And in the absence of reaction, they see something they've never truly known, your sovereignty. The ability to remain unmoved in the face of their storm. And that steadiness, that self-mastery, is more powerful than any confrontation. Because it speaks volumes without a word. It tells them, I no longer need to defend my truth. I no longer need to convince you of my boundaries. I no longer explain what I know is real. This is what makes your presence radioactive. Because it shines a light on their manipulation. On the emotional economy they tried to run. And light doesn't argue with the dark, it just reveals. That's why you're a threat. Not because you expose them intentionally, but because your peace exposes their chaos. Your center reveals their emptiness. Your discipline confronts their indulgence. You simply being, just being, forces them to ask questions they're not ready to answer. Like, why does this person no longer respond the way they used to? Why don't they justify their decisions anymore? Why does their silence feel louder than their voice ever did? The answer lies in one word: transformation. You didn't just learn boundaries. You became them. You didn't just memorize Stoic quotes. You embodied the practice. You walked through fire and emerged steel. And steel doesn't scream. Steel doesn't beg. Steel stands. They're mad because their old tactics bounce off now. The guilt trips? Ineffective. The gaslighting? Transparent. The manipulation? Predictable. And nothing frustrates the manipulator more than predictability that doesn't bend in their favor. You used to be a mystery they could unravel. Now you're a truth they can't escape. And when truth meets illusion, only one survives. That's why they fight harder now. That's why the attacks are personal. Because their ego is at war with your evolution. And they're losing. Every time you don't respond, you win. Every time you stay calm, you disarm. Every time you hold your peace, you dismantle the game. Not because you're cold, but because you're focused. And this focus wasn't handed to you, it was earned. Through nights of confusion. Through battles with identity. Through painful separations that force you to redefine what it means to be whole. Now that wholeness is a beacon. And those still broken aren't sure whether to follow it or destroy it. So some choose destruction. They try to distort your light, not because it's flawed, but because it's real. And reality is offensive to those who live in delusion. They'll say you changed. You did. But they won't admit that what you changed into is what they feared they never could. Whole. Disciplined. Unshakable. This is the path of Stoicism. Not passive indifference. but powerful restraint. Choosing not to fight battles that only drain your energy. Choosing to conserve your soul for what truly matters. That's presence. And presence is the most confrontational energy there is. Because it doesn't flinch. It doesn't chase. It doesn't demand. It simply stands. And in a world where most people draw strength from noise, from drama, from reaction, your stillness is revolutionary. It tells a story without narration. It speaks of inner work, of discipline, of values that run deeper than approval. And that story? It shakes them. Because it forces them to confront their own. What have they built their identity on? What keeps them secure? If your silence feels like a threat, what does that say about their power? If your absence causes chaos, what does that reveal about the nature of your past relationship? It was never balanced. It was never mutual. It was built on your responsiveness, not your presence. On your vulnerability, not your values. And now that your values lead, they have no script to follow. That's what Stoic relationships demand, not emotional obedience, but mutual respect. A respect that doesn't need performance to prove its worth. You now move like someone who knows their worth. Who doesn't ask for permission to breathe. Who doesn't beg for space to exist. And for those who needed your dependence to feel important, that movement is a threat. A calm, quiet, irreversible threat. Because it doesn't shout. It doesn't flail. It just walks. And nothing is more intimidating than someone who walks in their truth, who leaves behind false connection not with rage but with reverence. They're not used to that. They're used to reactions. To drama. To exits filled with explosions. But you gave them none of that. You gave them closure without conversation. Resolution without rehearsal. You didn't need their permission to move on. And that haunts them? Because you proved they never held what they thought they did, your soul. That was always yours. And now you've reclaimed it. Not with rage. Not with revenge. But with stillness. A presence so profound, so rooted in self, it dismantles everything around it that was built on pretense. You didn't have to expose them. You exposed yourself, to yourself. And in that unveiling, the truth was revealed to everyone. That's why they're mad. That's why they're scared. Because you've become something they never expected, whole. And wholeness doesn't negotiate with dysfunction. It simply exists. Quietly. Powerfully. Unapologetically. 4. Emotional reactions are proof of your power. Let's get one thing straight. People don't throw tantrums over things they don't care about. They don't obsess over things that don't threaten them. So when their voices get louder, their criticisms sharper, and their attacks more personal, it's not because you've become a villain. It's because you've become powerful. The paradox is clear. The more peace you cultivate inside, the more chaos you provoke outside, from those who thrived on your former instability. You're no longer giving them the performance they grew used to. No longer apologizing for being whole. No longer explaining yourself to make others feel secure. And that change? It unsettles them. Deeply. Because when you stop reacting, you take away their control. When you stop defending, you take away their leverage. When you no longer try to fix what's not yours, they lose their favorite game, emotional chess. And that loss of control? It feels to them like abandonment. But it's not you abandoning them. It's you returning to yourself. That's a different kind of abandonment. One that terrifies those who relied on your emotional labor to soothe their own wounds. And they may not even realize that's what they're doing. They just feel your shift, your clarity, your groundedness, and they panic. But they don't say, "I'm scared." They say, "You're selfish." They don't say, "I feel insecure." They say, "You've changed." They don't say, "I miss the version of you I could manipulate." They say, "You're cold now." Do you see it? The labels they throw at you are projections, not truths. Their accusations are confessions wrapped in distortion. Because if they were truly at peace, your peace wouldn't disturb them. But it does. It highlights the parts of themselves they've refused to confront. Your calm is a spotlight. Your composure is a mirror. Your refusal to crumble is a confrontation. Not with them, but with the story they've told themselves about who you are and who they are in relation to you. And every time you hold your ground, you crack that story wide open. They realize you were never the weak one. You were the loyal one. You were never too emotional. You were just too available. You were never the problem. You were the placeholder for a wound they never dealt with. And now that you've withdrawn from that role, now that you've stepped out of the emotional entanglement, they're left with their own reflection. And that reflection isn't kind. It asks hard questions. Like, why did they need you to suffer for the relationship to work? Why did they only feel connected when you were uncertain? Why did they feel powerful only when you were bending? And the answers to those questions are brutal. They reveal not just imbalance, but injustice. A relationship built not on mutual care, but on unequal expectations. Expectations you used to carry with grace, until you couldn't anymore. Until you woke up and said, "I'm not doing this. I'm not playing this role. I'm not shrinking myself to make you feel whole." That's not cruelty. That's clarity. And clarity is one of the greatest disruptors of emotional manipulation. Because when you're clear, you don't negotiate your worth. You don't barter with your values. You don't allow guilt to be used as currency. And to those who've always depended on your confusion to stay in control, that clarity feels like violence. But it's not violence. It's freedom. It's stoicism in action, the ability to remain firm in your inner truth, even when the world reacts with volatility. And yes, they will react. With urgency. With rage. With pain. Because your growth isn't neutral to them, it's a threat to the dynamic they once counted on. And that's where your power is most visible. Not in how loud you speak, but in how little you engage. Not in how forcefully you push back, but in how gracefully you move on. Your power lies in your silence, your standards, your sovereignty. And they feel that. They feel the shift. They feel your absence of need. And that absence is not a void, it's a boundary. One they never expected you to build. And now that it's there, they scramble. They say anything they can to tear it down. They tell others you're the problem. They rewrite history. They distort your motives. But none of that can touch you, unless you let it. Because their emotional reaction isn't a verdict. It's a symptom. A symptom of your rising. A sign that your presence now operates on a different frequency. One that can't be accessed through drama, guilt, or fear. That's power. The kind that doesn't need to dominate. The kind that doesn't shout. The kind that simply refuses to bow. And that refusal? That's what they hate. Not because it's wrong, but because it works. Because it reclaims everything they thought they owned, your time, your energy, your emotions. But you've taken those back. You've remembered who you are. And in doing so, you've reminded them of who they're not ready to be. That's why they're emotional. That's why they lash out. That's why they accuse. Because you represent the path they didn't walk. The boundaries they never held. The courage they never found. And that representation, whether you intend it or not, is confronting. It shakes their identity. It dissolves their illusion of superiority. It calls out the control they never earned, only exploited. You didn't steal anything from them. You stopped handing it over. And that boundary? That silence? That refusal to bow? It speaks louder than any scream ever could. You've chosen strength over compliance. Integrity over comfort. Peace over performance. And in doing so, you've exposed the lie that said their emotions were your responsibility. They never were. And the moment you stopped treating them like they were, the moment you gave their pain back to them, you became free. And yes, they'll call that abandonment. But it's not. It's release. It's accountability. It's saying, I'm not here to carry your wound anymore. I have my own healing to honor. And that's what they can't forgive, not a betrayal, but a boundary. Not a departure, but a declaration, I choose me. And if you're watching this right now, if you're feeling the storm that follows your growth, know this, your strength isn't the problem. It's the proof. The proof that you've evolved. The proof that you've reclaimed your power. The proof that you are no longer playing the game. And if that truth is hitting home, like this video and comment. Number 1. If this is your reminder that their emotional chaos is not your responsibility. Subscribe to this channel for more content that keeps you grounded in your power, your peace, and your truth. You're not wrong. You're just done bending. And that changes everything. 5. Your growth threatens their identity. They told themselves you would always be predictable, malleable, tame. The version of you that tiptoed around their moods, the one that shrank for peace, apologized just to avoid conflict. That's who they invested in. That's the version they thought they owned. But then something shifted. Not in volume or violence, but in energy. You started choosing silence over reaction, clarity over confusion, solitude over dependence. And that growth, that transformation, that steady unraveling of your former self, it wasn't just personal. It was a message. One that said, I am no longer who I was. I don't exist to support your narrative anymore. And that message hit deeper than any argument ever could. Because it didn't just change the dynamic, it threatened their identity. You see, people build self-concepts around the roles others play. They tell themselves they're the strong one because you used to be fragile. They see themselves as the leader because you used to follow. They feel needed because you used to be available. But when you evolved, you pulled the rug out from under all those roles. You stopped being the person that justified their ego. You stopped mirroring back their self-image. And suddenly, they had to face something terrifying. The possibility that they were never who they thought they were. That their sense of self was built not on truth, but on comparison. Not on character, but on contrast. And with that contrast gone, with you no longer fitting the role, the whole illusion began to shake. That's why they say you change like it's a crime. That's why they act like your growth is betrayal. Because it is, to the version of them that only existed in relation to your old self. But growth doesn't ask for permission. And it never owes an apology. What they call betrayal is simply you outgrowing a container you were never meant to stay in. You didn't abandon them, you honored your evolution. And in doing so, you challenged theirs. Because if you can grow, if you can change, if you can heal, what does that say about them? It says they could have too. It says they had the same opportunity but didn't take it. And now they must face the cost of that choice. A cost they were willing to live with, until you reminded them it was a choice. That's what makes them mad. Not your rebellion, not your independence, but what it says about their stagnation. You've become living proof that staying stuck is not inevitable. That silence is not safety. That strength is not reserved for the special few. It's available to anyone who chooses truth over approval. And that's a hard pill to swallow. Because now, every time they see you walking in peace, speaking with conviction, moving without explanation, they don't see someone who left. They see someone who woke up. And that awakening is an indictment. Not because you're judging them, but because your life, your presence, your wholeness, it disrupts their denial. It confronts the stories they've told themselves to justify why they never tried, why they stayed small, why they accepted the bare minimum. But you didn't. You chose differently. And that choice shakes them, because it makes them question every time they didn't. So what do they do with that discomfort? They don't process it. They project it. They throw it at you in the form of insults, distance, gossip, and disdain. But don't let that fool you. The louder they talk, the more threatened they feel. The more aggressive they become, the more exposed they are. Because people who are secure in their path don't need to tear others down. Only those clinging to a fragile identity feel endangered by someone else's growth. And your growth, let's be clear, wasn't small. It was seismic. It wasn't cosmetic, it was core. You didn't just change habits. You changed values. You didn't just create new routines. You created a new standard for what you'll allow, what you'll accept, and what you'll entertain. And that new standard? It's intimidating to those who benefited from your old ones. Because they can't reach you there. Not unless they rise too. And rising requires accountability, reflection, discomfort. Most people aren't ready for that. So they demand you come back down. Not because they miss you, but because they miss the version of themselves that felt powerful next to you. You were their mirror. Now you're their reminder. A reminder of effort avoided. Of truth suppressed. Of potential left untouched. And that reminder hurts. But healing isn't about avoiding pain. It's about facing it. And you faced yours. You walked through it. You sat with your shadow. You questioned the roles you played and why. You examined every pattern, every people-pleasing instinct, every boundary you let blur. You did the work. And now they see the results. The glow. The peace. The firmness. The self-respect. It's undeniable. And it makes them uncomfortable because it reminds them of what they've neglected in themselves. That's not on you. You're not responsible for their avoidance. You're not their parent, their therapist, or their savior. You're a person who chose to stop betraying yourself. And in doing so, you triggered the part of them that still does. That's what Stoic relationships demand, self-responsibility. The understanding that connection without integrity is codependence. That love without self-awareness is just projection. And now that you've grown beyond projection, you can't be used the same way. You can't be guilted into dimming your light. You can't be baited into old roles. You've reclaimed too much. Sacrificed too much. Learned too much. So when they say you've changed, smile. Because you have. You've become someone who no longer confuses silence for peace. Who no longer mistakes acceptance for love. Who no longer believes that being needed is the same as being respected. That's growth. That's power. And it's threatening. Not to everyone. But to those who needed you to stay small to feel okay. You didn't choose to threaten them. You chose to liberate yourself. And their discomfort is the collateral damage of your freedom. That's the truth. And it's sacred. 6. They don't hate you, they hate what you represent. They see you, but they don't really see you. What they see is what you've become. What you represent. What your very existence now echoes every time you walk into the room. You represent something most people don't want to face, the truth that submission was always a choice. That silence wasn't virtue, it was fear. That playing small never made anyone safe, only controllable. And now that you've stopped bowing, you reflect the terrifying possibility that they could have done the same, and didn't. That's what's unbearable. That's the sting they can't numb. It's not your attitude. It's not your boundaries. It's not your refusal to tolerate dysfunction. It's the fact that your clarity disrupts the illusion they built their life around. You don't even have to say a word. Your mere presence is a revolution. You are the living proof that people can evolve, that self-respect is not a fantasy, that stoicism is more than theory, it's the foundation for inner freedom. And because you've chosen truth over comfort, because you've stopped performing, they can't use you as their emotional crutch anymore. You're not holding space for their unhealed wounds. You're not making excuses for their mistreatment. You're not dimming your light so they feel tall. And that decision, that sovereign, irreversible decision, has made you a symbol. Not just of strength, but of accountability. And accountability is an enemy to the ego. Because it doesn't just demand action, it demands reflection. And reflection is the one thing those who've built their self-worth on control can't tolerate. They'd rather accuse than admit. Rather shame than change. Rather project than process. So when you stopped participating in the charade, they didn't just lose a person, they lost their sense of power. Their illusion of control collapsed. Their role in your story was rewritten. And they didn't like the new draft. Because in this one, you don't bend. You don't chase. You don't explain your worth. You just are. Steady. Silent. Resolved. You embody the kind of freedom they've convinced themselves is dangerous. Because if everyone walked in truth like you, their systems of manipulation wouldn't survive a single day. And deep down, they know that. They feel that. That's why they rage. Because you no longer serve their image. Because you won't kneel to the script they wrote for you. You're not the side character anymore. You've become the author of your own life. And when someone is used to directing everyone around them, the presence of a free thinker isn't just inconvenient, it's explosive. You aren't a problem. You're a reflection of the problem. You highlight everything they've chosen to ignore. Their fears. Their avoidance. Their lack of integrity. And instead of dealing with those things, they'd rather deal with you. By labeling you. Mocking you. Isolating you. But here's what they'll never admit. They envy you. Not your success. Not your following. Not your words. They envy your freedom. Your peace. Your refusal. Because it's a reminder that they, too, had a choice, but gave it away for validation. They bowed to approval. You didn't. And that choice, though quiet, is deafening. It haunts them. Because every time they see you walk without flinching, every time you stay centered in a storm, every time you stand in your truth without blinking, they feel their own collapse inching closer. And that's not your fault. That's the cost of truth. Because truth, when fully lived, doesn't just shine, it blinds. It burns away everything fake. Everything fragile. Everything false. And that burning, to the unprepared, feels like betrayal. They'll say you changed. But what they mean is you healed. They'll say you're selfish. But what they mean is, you stopped sacrificing your peace. They'll say you're cold. But what they mean is, you're no longer emotionally available for their chaos. You're no longer the cushion for their consequences. You're no longer the echo chamber for their ego. And that shift, your shift, is irreversible. Because you've tasted truth now. You've experienced the stillness that comes from not needing to explain. The calm that grows from not engaging. The power of knowing who you are and not apologizing for it. That's not temporary. That's not performative. That's transformation. And they know it. They can see it in your eyes. In the way you don't argue. In the way you don't chase. In the way you let the noise pass like a storm around a mountain. Because that's what you are now, a mountain. And those who once controlled you can't move you anymore. They can throw words like rocks, but none of them stick. You've risen too high. Rooted too deep. Found too much clarity. That's the core of Stoic relationships. Not dependence, but discipline. Not power plays, but presence. And presence, when forged in pain, becomes impenetrable. So yes, they're mad. Let them be. Their anger is not a sign you've failed, it's a sign you've finally succeeded. You are no longer bending for applause. You are no longer shrinking for peace. You've realized that approval is the cheapest currency and truth is the most expensive freedom. And you've paid that price. With isolation. With ridicule. With loss. But the reward is priceless, peace. The kind that doesn't wobble with others' emotions. The kind that doesn't flinch at mischaracterization. The kind that doesn't depend on agreement to feel whole. You've entered a new realm now. One where growth is non-negotiable. Where boundaries aren't explanations, they're declarations. Where your silence isn't empty, it's sacred. You don't owe anyone the old version of you. You don't owe them comfort at the cost of your clarity. You owe yourself truth. You owe yourself integrity. You owe yourself peace. And peace doesn't bow. It doesn't beg. It doesn't blend in to keep others from breaking. It just is. Steady. Still. Undeniable. So if this part of the journey resonates with you, if you feel your evolution reflected in these words, then like this video and comment, number 1, below. Subscribe for more content like this that honors your growth, your boundaries, and your return to self. You're not the villain in their story. You're the ending. And the ending is sacred. So here you are, standing where many never dared to walk. Not because you sought conflict, but because you chose peace. And real peace, the kind that doesn't dissolve under pressure, comes at a price most are unwilling to pay. It costs you the illusion of harmony, the facade of connection, the temporary comfort of approval. But what it gives you is something far rarer, The unshakable knowing that you are whole, even when misunderstood, even when alone. That wholeness, that grounded, soul-deep strength, is not loud. It doesn't parade. It doesn't need to be justified. It's lived. Quietly. Fully. Authentically. And that kind of living doesn't make you universally loved. It makes you disruptive. Not because you are trying to provoke, but because your existence without performance makes those still stuck in performance deeply uncomfortable. They'll say you're arrogant, that you think you're better. They'll twist your stillness into hostility, your honesty into aggression. But don't fall for it. They don't hate you. They hate the freedom you represent. Because your presence whispers a truth they buried for too long, they too could walk away. They too could choose self-respect. They too could stop bowing. But they didn't. And seeing you do it reminds them of what they've refused to become. That's not your burden. That's their reckoning. You don't owe them a version of you that no longer exists just to make them feel comfortable in their confinement. You've evolved. Not out of spite. Not to prove anything. But because staying small started to feel like suffocating. Because pretending started to feel like betrayal. Because shrinking for love, for safety, for validation, was killing your spirit. And now that you've chosen yourself, now that you've stepped into your own rhythm, your own values, your own boundaries, they want the old you back. Not because they loved you more, but because they could use you more. The truth is, they never saw you. They saw a reflection of what they needed. And now that reflection doesn't play along. Now you don't bend when they press. Now you don't answer when they call with old patterns. And that silence? It's louder than any scream. It tells them the game is over. Not because you want revenge. Not because you hate them. But because you've reclaimed something they never thought you would. Your power. Your mind. Your voice. Your time. You've chosen to stop bleeding for relationships that only thrive when you're in pain. You've chosen to disappoint others instead of betraying yourself. That choice isn't always celebrated. It's often condemned. But it's sacred. Because it's the only path that leads to real inner peace. And peace, unlike performance, is sustainable. It grows in silence. In solitude. In integrity. That's the foundation of Stoicism. Not emotional suppression, but emotional mastery. The ability to act with principle when others demand reaction. To hold the line of your values even when it costs you proximity. To walk away from comfort when it requires your dignity. And now, after everything, you're no longer swayed by moods. No longer spun by manipulation. No longer baited by drama. You've become immovable. And they don't know what to do with someone they can't control. That's not your weakness. That's your freedom. And freedom makes people rage, not because it's cruel, but because it's rare. Most people don't live free. They live attached. To approval. To roles. To being seen a certain way. And when you drop all that, when you just are, unapologetically, consistently, with discipline, it cracks their foundation. Because you now live without asking for permission. You move without explaining. You love without losing yourself. That kind of presence doesn't just inspire, it convicts. It reflects. It rattles. And some people will call that distance. Coldness. Arrogance. Let them. You're no longer in the business of shrinking to soothe fragile egos. You're no longer explaining boundaries to people who benefit from crossing them. You're no longer auditioning for a role in someone else's story. This is your story now. And in this story, you choose truth over comfort. Strength over compliance. Peace over chaos. Every single time. And if that costs you the comfort of old connections, so be it. You're not paying for peace with your soul anymore. That bill's overdue. And the moment you stopped bowing, the moment you said, "No more," everything changed. Not because they let you go, but because you let go. Of guilt. Of fear. Of the lie that love requires self-erasure. That strength is selfish. That discipline makes you distant. Those beliefs were chains. And now, with each breath, you're walking lighter. Stronger. clearer. Stoicism isn't about becoming cold. It's about becoming centered. It's about no longer confusing your emotions for instructions. It's about holding the storm without becoming the storm. That's the kind of strength they never prepared for. The kind they hoped you'd never discover. Because now, you're a mirror not just for them, but for everyone still playing the game. And some will run. Others will attack. But a few, just a few, will be inspired. They'll see you and remember who they were before they bowed. Before they compromised. Before they shrank. And maybe, just maybe, your freedom will give them permission to choose the same. That's how the world changes. Not with noise, but with quiet conviction. With one person refusing to bow, then another, until the lie that submission is noble finally dies. You didn't start a war. You ended one. The war within. The war between who you were and who you knew you could be. That battle was fought in silence. In the shadows. In moments no one saw. And now you walk as the result of that victory. Not loud. Not proud. But free. And freedom, once tasted, is never forgotten. It lingers. It echoes. It builds legacies, not through applause, but through alignment. You are no longer living to be palatable. You're living to be principled. No longer playing roles, just living truth. And that, more than anything else, is what makes you powerful. Not because of what you say, but because of what you've become. Solid. Rooted. Real. Unshakable. Let them be mad. Let them talk. Let them twist the story. You don't need to defend who you are. Your life now speaks louder than their words ever could. And that silence? That presence? That unwavering clarity? It's not weakness. It's mastery. It's the reward for every hard decision you made when no one understood. It's the fruit of every sleepless night you chose growth over guilt. And that, my friend, is the kind of peace no one can take. Because you didn't beg for it. You built it. One breath at a time. One boundary at a time. One sacred no at a time. You didn't just stop bowing. You rose. And in rising, you've become untouchable.